the American founder, George Washington. He won a nation's freedom, then refused its crown.
On December 23, 1783, inside the Maryland State House in Annapolis, a victorious 51-year-old general stood before the Continental Congress. He had just defeated the most powerful military empire on Earth. He commanded the absolute loyalty of thousands of armed, unpaid, and frustrated soldiers who would have gladly marched on the fragile new government and installed him as a dictator or a king. Yet, with his hands trembling sadly as he held his speech, George Washington did the unthinkable. He resigned his military commission. "I consider it an indispensable duty to close this last solemn act of my official life," he declared, before mounting his horse and riding home to Virginia. When King George III of Great Britain heard a rumor that Washington planned to surrender his extraordinary power, the monarch reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, and died on December 14, 1799. He was an American military commander, statesman, colonial planter, and the first president of the United States, serving 2 consecutive terms from 1789 to 1797. His primary fields of influence were military leadership and national politics. Washington is considered profoundly influential because he successfully led the Continental Army to a highly improbable victory in the American Revolutionary War, and subsequently established the foundational precedents for the executive branch of the American Republic. In a global era entirely dominated by monarchs and emperors, Washington's insistence on a peaceful transfer of democratic power created the functional blueprint for the modern democratic state. George Washington was born into the middle ranks of the Virginia planter aristocracy, the first child of Augustine Washington and his second wife, Mary Ball Washington. His early reality was defined by sudden economic disparity and familial loss. When George was just 11 years old in 1743, his father died unexpectedly. This event drastically altered his life trajectory. The bulk of the family estate went to his older half-brother, Lawrence. George inherited a much smaller property, Ferry Farm, along with 10 enslaved people. Because of his father's death, Washington missed out on the classical European education enjoyed by his older peers. Instead, he received a highly pragmatic education in mathematics, geometry, and land surveying. At age 15, he began mapping the rugged Virginia frontier. By 1749, at the remarkable age of 17, he was appointed the official surveyor of Culpeper County. This early, rugged career yielded an intimate knowledge of the American land, nurtured his vast physical endurance, and ignited a lifelong obsession with westward expansion. The most profound early influence on Washington's life was his half-brother, Lawrence, who served as a surrogate father and introduced George to the powerful Fairfax family. The Fairfaxes were among the wealthiest landowners in Virginia, and their political patronage opened doors for the ambitious young surveyor. In 1751, a 19-year-old George traveled with a sick Lawrence to the island of Barbados in the Caribbean, the only time Washington ever left the North American continent. During this trip, George contracted smallpox. He survived, granting him lifelong biological immunity that later miraculously saved him during the disease-ridden camps of the Revolutionary War. Lawrence died of tuberculosis in 1752. A devastating emotional blow that also positioned George to eventually inherit the 2,000-acre Mount Vernon estate. Additionally, the harsh colonial frontier shaped Washington's stoic temperament. He learned early that survival required strict discipline and the ability to command respect through physical presence. He meticulously transcribed the rules of civility and decent behavior, which permanently molded his lifelong obsession with honor, reputation, and public appearance. Washington's violent transition from a private land surveyor to a famous public figure occurred in the deep backwoods of the Ohio River Valley. In 1753, Virginia's colonial governor dispatched the 21-year-old Major Washington to demand that French forces vacate territory claimed by the British. When the French refused, Washington was sent back the following year with a small militia. On May 28, 1754, Washington's forces ambushed a French detachment at Jumonville Glen. The French commander was killed under historically disputed circumstances, an explosive event that ignited the French and Indian War. Shortly after, Washington was forced to surrender at the poorly constructed Fort Necessity on July 3, 1754, his first and only military surrender. Despite this strategic failure, his reputation for sheer bravery grew exponentially. During the disastrous Battle of the Monongahela on July 9, 1755, where British General Edward Braddock was killed, Washington rallied the surviving troops. He had 2 horses shot out from under him and found 4 bullet holes in his coat, yet emerged totally unscathed. This miraculous survival convinced many that Providence was preserving him. By his mid-20s, he was the most famous colonial military officer in America. Washington's ultimate historical breakthrough arrived on June 15, 1775. Following the bloody battles of Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia to organize a unified, desperate response against the British Crown. Realizing the vital political necessity of appointing a Southerner to unite the disparate colonies, Congress unanimously elected the 43-year-old Virginian as Commander-in-Chief of the newly formed Continental Army. Washington had arrived at the Congress wearing his blue and buff military uniform, a silent but unmistakable signal that he was ready to fight. He refused a traditional salary, asking only to be reimbursed for his strict expenses. He transformed overnight from a wealthy Virginia planter into the singular, unifying symbol of the American Rebellion. Without his sheer force of personality, the fractured and underfunded militias of the 13 colonies would have rapidly disintegrated. Washington's life was defined by a series of monumental achievements spanning the military and political arenas. December 25th to 26th, 1776, facing the total collapse of the Revolution, Washington boldly crossed the icy Delaware River with 2,400 troops and launched a brilliant surprise attack on Trenton, New Jersey. He captured over 900 Hessian mercenaries, completely revitalizing the American cause. Winter 1777 to 1778, at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, Washington held his freezing, starving army together through an agonizing winter, using the time to allow Baron von Steuben to drill the desperate troops into a professional military force. October 19, 1781, aided heavily by the French Navy, Washington commanded a combined force of approximately 17,000 soldiers to trap British General Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. Cornwallis's eventual surrender effectively ended the Revolutionary War. May to September 1787, Washington reluctantly presided over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. His solemn presence lent unquestionable legitimacy to the highly controversial drafting of the new United States Constitution. April 30, 1789, Washington was proudly inaugurated as the first president of the United States in New York City, having won all 69 available electoral college votes. 1793, he wisely issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, ensuring the fragile United States would entirely avoid the destructive war between Britain and revolutionary France. 1794, he successfully suppressed the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania, riding out to personally lead a force of 12,950 militiamen. This decisive action proved the new federal government could enforce its laws. While his improbable military victories were absolutely essential, Washington is most famous globally for his deliberate, unprecedented restraint of power. He was the indispensable man of the American founding, but his enduring international fame stemmed from his absolute refusal to become a monarch. In 1783, he voluntarily surrendered his military sword to civilian authorities. Later, in 1796, after serving 2 incredibly demanding terms as president, he published his farewell address and walked away from the highest office in the land. This brilliant precedent of a 2-term limit held unbroken until 1940. Enlightenment philosophers and citizens across Europe marveled at a commanding general who conquered a nation, only to hand it back to its citizens. Washington was a man deeply concerned with personal honor, civic duty, and his permanent historical reputation. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, with a broad, highly athletic frame, he physically dominated almost every room he entered. He was not a soaring intellectual or an elegant orator like his contemporaries Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton. Instead, his unique genius lay in his impeccable judgment, his profound patience, and his ability to synthesize radically opposing viewpoints.
He was highly disciplined, rising before dawn and maintaining meticulous financial ledgers throughout his entire life. However, beneath his icy, intensely stoic exterior was a man with a fierce, terrifying temper. He spent a lifetime learning to ruthlessly control his emotional outbursts. Washington was also plagued by agonizing dental issues. He had only one of his natural teeth remaining by his 1789 inauguration, relying on painful dentures made of ivory, brass, and human teeth. His personal religious beliefs leaned closely towards deism. He frequently spoke of an overarching providence guiding human events, but rarely mentioned strict Christian theology in his public writings.
Washington was certainly not flawless, and his vast legacy is heavily complicated by immense contradictions and political failures. Militarily, he technically lost more battles than he ever won. His severe tactical blunders in 1776 nearly resulted in the total destruction of his army in New York. As president, his painful second term was marred by vicious, destructive partisan warfare between his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and his Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. Washington was fiercely attacked by the opposition press. Journalists accused him of adopting toxic monarchical airs and betraying the sacred ideals of the Revolution.
The most profound moral failure of Washington's life was his active participation in the brutal institution of chattel slavery. Over his lifetime, he bought, sold, and forced labor from hundreds of enslaved human beings. By 1799, there were exactly 317 enslaved individuals living at Mount Vernon. Washington directly owned 123 of them. While he expressed growing private discomfort with slavery in his final years, he aggressively pursued enslaved people who escaped his control, notably signing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and secretly using federal resources to hunt for Ona Judge, an enslaved woman who courageously fled his Philadelphia household. In his final will, he legally ordered that the enslaved people he owned be freed, but only after the death of his wife. He was the only slave-owning founding father to orchestrate a mass emancipation, yet his lifelong reliance on forced human labor remains a dark, defining shadow on his historical record. Washington's absolute influence was foundational to the immediate creation and survival of the United States. Politically, he entirely defined the actual powers of the American presidency. By appointing the first cabinet, establishing the tradition of the inaugural address, and asserting executive privilege, he literally created the machinery of the federal executive branch. His unwavering support for Alexander Hamilton's aggressive financial systems, including a national bank and federal assumption of state debts, saved the young nation from total economic ruin and established American credit on the global stage. His strict foreign policy of neutrality successfully kept the United States out of massive European wars for a century, allowing the fragile republic the necessary time to grow and stabilize. Culturally, he became an immediate mythological icon of Republican virtue. However, his failure to publicly address or attempt to politically abolish slavery at the national level left a deeply festering wound in the American political system, one that would eventually explode into the catastrophic American Civil War 60 years after his death.
Today, George Washington's legacy is woven to the very fabric of American society, yet it rightly faces modern critical scrutiny. He is universally recognized as the father of his country. His unsmiling image is omnipresent, carved permanently into the granite of Mount Rushmore, printed on the ubiquitous $1 bill, and stamped onto the $quarter-dollar coin.
The capital of the United States proudly bears his name, as does one U.S. state, 31 separate counties, and a towering 555-foot marble obelisk situated squarely on the National Mall. While modern historical scholars critically examine his deeply hypocritical role as an enslaver and a wealthy oligarch, he consistently ranks among the top 3 greatest U.S.
presidents in academic polling. He is globally recognized for providing the indispensable unifying gravity the young, highly volatile nation required to survive its precarious infancy. George Washington died of a severe bacterial throat infection on December 14, 1799, at the age of 67. His final recorded words were a calm acceptance of his fate. "'Tis well." Washington's remarkable life offers a profound, enduring study in the war exercise and the deliberate surrender of ultimate power. He possessed a rare, powerful combination of raw ambition, calculated political restraint, and unyielding physical endurance. He was a deeply flawed, highly complex man, heavily invested in an incredibly unjust system of human bondage, yet he was also a distinct political visionary who repeatedly refused absolute dictatorial power in favor of a democratic ideal.
History is tragically crowded with victorious generals who eagerly became tyrants, and passionate revolutionaries who ultimately became dictators. Washington completely broke that ancient cycle. Ultimately, his true historical greatness was defined not by the powerful armies he defeated or the vast wealth he accumulated, but by the extraordinary, boundless power he willingly gave away.